I wanted to start with just a quote, actually something from this essay that I had mentioned, Consul Schuette, as a way just to prompt beginning of a discussion. So this is what you said in the essay, German-Jewish Relations Today and Tomorrow. You said, hope for a genuine German-Jewish dialogue and for the respect of the Jewish people has become one of the strongest driving forces of post-war Germany's foreign relations in both the political and civic realms. But this has also been one of our most difficult goals to achieve. The question of whether and what kind of dialogue Jews should and could entertain with Germany after the Holocaust has been an equally difficult issue for Israel and American Jewish organizations, let alone for many individual Jews. So I'm wondering, maybe we could start with you. This was written maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and I'm wondering if this still seems to you an accurate summary of where things are, and also to ask you about the kind of dialogues that you see happening between Germans and Jews here in Germany or other places around the world.
Well, there are many different forms of dialogue, many different forums. And also when you talk about German-Jewish relations, you can talk about at least 3 different relationships. The one is between Germany and Israel. The other one, most important one, is between Germany and American Jewry. And then you can also talk about relationship between non-Jewish and Jewish Germans, which is a subject which is very important when we talk about German-Jewish relations today, because that is an aspect that is virtually not known very well. Whether something has changed in the last 4 years, I would say it's a continuum. It's a process that has started very early after the end of the Holocaust, and in the late 40s, early 50s, when there was the beginning of the German-Israeli relationship. And there are many stages in this, and it is important to note that at the beginning, this was basically a relationship between civil societies in the 2 countries. Trade unions, scientists, churches, religious groups, and so on. And later on it became an official relationship. For many reasons, and that is one of the subjects of this little publication, the dialogue between American Jewry and Germany started somewhat later. There were organizations like the American Jewish Committee who were involved very early on, but in general, this kind of dialogue was much later, but also developed very far. But there are still quite a number of differences.
Consul Tor, any observations?
I think that in talking about this relationship, I think there is a big difference between the German-Jewish relationship and the German-Israel relationship. The German-Israel relationship began at Israel's inception, and then in 1952 with the signing of a reparations agreement between Konrad Adenauer and David Ben-Gurion, which basically, in which the new Germany became instrumental in the establishment and success of Israel. Israel would have been collapsed economically without this infusion of tens, probably hundreds of millions of German marks into the Israeli economy. But it's not only a historic fact, I think it means something very definitive about the nature of the relationship. Germany paid reparations to Holocaust victims as individuals because of their suffering. It paid reparations to the State of Israel. Perhaps formally it was defined as aid to help with the rehabilitation of Holocaust victims, but in fact, it was a contribution to the Jewish future, or to the future of Israel. And it's something which has very, very much defined the relationship. It came to fruition, I think, in Israel's 60th birthday. You see something very unusual. Angela Merkel, a product of East Germany, leads the entire German cabinet to Jerusalem for a joint session with the Israeli cabinet to mark the 60th anniversary of Israel. It's unprecedented. The Israeli government never had such a meeting. German government never had such a meeting. And yet, it's unprecedented, and yet it's natural, because in this relationship, Germany understands, maybe better than any other country, to my dismay, maybe better to even many segments of Jewry, they understand the historical meaning of Israel, the change and the necessity of Israel. And so I think this relationship has grown. Germany is Israel's second largest trade partner, its largest trade partner in Europe. Germany is exporting to Israel as a trade partner in the Middle East. It's one of the leading trade partners, and yet there are bumps in the relationship as well. But formally, we are very, very close, and I think we have seen a continuum and a deepening. I'm not sure it'll continue that way.
Maybe we'll probe a little further that comment in a moment. Rabbi Pierce, any thoughts, especially in terms of American context and being the senior rabbi at a German-founded Jewish congregation in San Francisco?
Yes. Good evening. First of all, it's nice to see so many members of the congregation here. Thank you for coming. I grew up in a culture in which was basically anti-German. I was born in 1946, and so there were many people that I came into contact with who were survivors, who were struggling to remake their lives in the United States, and even those who had not been directly impacted by the Shoah, the Holocaust. There was enormous enmity and hatred, and a sense that these were people who would never go to Germany, who would never buy a German product, never drive a German car. Even the hearing of the German language was offensive to many people of that era. And so I grew up swearing that I would never go to Germany, and I have been to Germany, and it's an amazing place. But I can remember the first time I was a young rabbinic student flying on El Al to Israel, only to discover that the plane was putting down in Munich to refuel, and I was enraged, because here I was being not only forced to be in Germany, but by El Al. And that's when I realized, as a parenthetically, that El Al used to stand for every landing always late. They've gotten much better. I'm an equal opportunity discriminator. So the issue is, how do we move from that sense that we never want to have anything to do with anything German? So I set foot in Israel for the first time in 1969, and coming out of this culture where no one would ever own a German car, only to see hundreds, thousands of Volkswagens all over Israel, and it was this enormous cultural shock. And I realized at that moment how Germany was beginning to repair and to do what I would call tshuva, asking for forgiveness for what has happened. And having someone like Rolf Schuette here in San Francisco, who has reached out in so many extraordinary ways to the Jewish community. He's had dozens and dozens of contacts, public speaking in congregations, and that is indicative. But again, the whole issue of how do you finally achieve redemption for what is perhaps the most horrendous crime against humanity, certainly in the modern period. And I think if I can just go back very briefly to the biblical model, when Joseph was the prime minister of Egypt, and his brothers appeared before him, he set up a situation in which Benjamin would be held ransom, basically to test whether his brothers ever had sought redemption for what they had done to him. And so when Judah stepped forward and said, please take one of us in place of Benjamin, and they protected the youngest brother, it's only at that point that Joseph reveals himself and says, I am Joseph, does my father still live? So what is redemptive? Several years ago, there was an awful incident in which an immigrant in Germany had been murdered, and hundreds of thousands of people came out in a candlelighting ceremony to express their outrage and their support for decent human behavior. That's the kind of thing that is redemptive, and that I know that Germany is working very hard to achieve. But beyond that, I mean, my comment is that Germany has to bend over backwards to be the kind of friend that it has been to Israel, only more so. There may be instances in which the government doesn't even agree with the policies of Israel, and they have to keep quiet about that. They have to say, we are here to support Israel no matter what. And that's a tough road to hoe, particularly in this society in which we're living.
I had a conversation with Susan Hiller, whose work on the J Street Project is in the Swig Gallery down here. And one of the things that she told me that I thought was really interesting was that as an artist spending time in Germany, she felt that Germany was absolutely suffused with history, almost, I think she said, overburdened with history. And we were also talking about the way that if you spend time in Jerusalem, or many other places in Israel too, you also have the sense of history being present constantly, and that is something that can feel overbearing, but for artists at least, it's interesting in terms of getting traction in some way. And I'm just thinking about the connections between Israel and Germany both being similar. One of the connections between them is that history has weighed so heavily on them in the last 100 years. Does that strike anybody in any way?
Well, the topic of the talk tonight is German-Jewish relations in the 21st century. So that leads to the conclusion that we don't want to talk about the past. But that is impossible, especially when you look at the German-Jewish relationship. And of course, the Holocaust is the most harrowing experience in both Jewish and German history. And I think it sounds strange when you say it that way, but it is the element that both separates and binds Jews and Germans like probably no other two peoples. And so my view is that even though when a German and a Jew meet and they realize that they are German and a Jew, they will most likely not address this most harrowing past of their collective memory of their peoples, but it's in their head. They will not talk about it, but it's omnipresent. So, talking about the subject of tonight is just impossible, because even if we tried to, you, me, him, we all reflect this very horrible, harrowing past. The question is, as you say, is there a way to redemption, and what can you do? And I think modern-day Germans, in their vast majority, not all, there are right-wingers, there are neo-Nazis, there are Holocaust deniers, and there are also groups on the other side, but I think for the vast majority is that people believe that they are aware of this past, but they can't make the past undone. But what they can do is to draw the lessons from this past. And when you, Akiva, talked about the early stages of German-Israeli relations, this hand that was extended, at least by a part of the Israeli society, part of the parties, it was not uncontroversial, of course, understandably. That was one element where Germany, after the war, thought that if Israel, as the Jewish state, or Jews individually, recognize that you can reestablish contact with Germany and with Germans, that is the kind of litmus test that Germany has changed. So it was not altogether all altruistic, or because Germany felt that Israel and Germany, after the war, shared same principles of democracy or human rights, whatever, but it was also the attempt of redemption. And the other thing is, the other litmus test, I think, is if Jews today, in the 21st century maybe, decide or are ready to live again in modern-day Germany, that is another proof that Germany has drawn the right lessons from the past and is again a country where Jews can feel at home. Of course, we can talk about it, and not all Jews feel the same about Germany, even the ones that live in Germany. But if the Jewish community grows and people arrive even from Israel or from the United States, wherever, for us, it's a kind of, you may say, proof that this is a different Germany than the one that existed before 1945.
Do we think that we're moving towards another kind of era? Is there an identifiable new era upon us? Consul Tor, you mentioned some possible bumps in the road, and I'm wondering whether you have a sense of a period ending the last 60 years or so. Is there a sense that we're collectively moving into a new historical or political space?
I think a couple of things are happening. For example, I was listening to Rolf describe the revival of the Jewish community in Germany, and I have to admit that from a Zionistic perspective, that's completely wrong. What should the Jews have learned? The German Jews, more than any others, that they have a national home. So this is, for example, I think a very interesting kind of different ways of looking at it. I completely understand Rolf, as well as the German government's policy of trying to, I believe it's the policy of the German government to try to achieve a Jewish population in Germany which equals that of pre-World War II. I think that was one of the policy ideas. We might think it's wrong-headed, but that's okay. I think, but on the other hand, for example, when Mrs. Merkel came to Israel for the 60th anniversary and she spoke to the Knesset, her English is excellent, but she insisted on speaking in German. And it was slightly controversial, but to tell the truth, I don't think it was really controversial. There were some members of Knesset who made an issue of it. But by and large, look, the Israeli Philharmonic has already played Wagner. Zubin Mehta forced us to acknowledge that a 19th century anti-Semite might still be a musical genius, and we had to listen. And so I think that we were ready to hear Mrs. Merkel speak in German. I'm not sure that we're ready for some of the other things. I think the challenges that I was referring to are the following. On the one hand, from a formal perspective, Germany, as Rabbi Pierce mentioned, sees itself as having a particular role in the international scene, and that is to help Israel thrive. There are many other European governments who can criticize Israel 28 and 29 hours a day. It doesn't have to be Germany's job. And that's, I think, correct. But a frustration on our side, I think, at times is that we sometimes feel that in Germany there is a recognition, and we appreciate it, that we appreciate Germany's truthfulness about itself, which is very, very rare to find anywhere on the European continent in any of the other countries. Germany has told the truth to itself and has learned its lesson. But sometimes, so on the one hand, we have a pillar of German foreign policy, which is support for Israel. But we don't always find a similar understanding of Israel in German civil society. And so I think that if we will walk around in Berlin or in Munich or in any other major German city, you will not find a similar, my sense is, a similar feeling about Israel as you would in an American city. In other words, a kind of cultural resonance, political resonance, sense of being allies, sense of similarity that you find between the average American and the average Israeli. I'm not sure that you will find that in the streets of Germany. And I admit that's painful for us.
Akiva, I really appreciate the notion of the Zionist dream of everyone packing up and moving to Israel, but I think that you inadvertently demonstrated the importance of a diaspora. One of the reasons that America, the United States, has such a powerful interest in Israel is because of the significant role that a very small minority, Jews in significant cities, plays in the support of Israel. In Germany, that is absent because the German Jewish population is 40,000, something like that.
Now approaching
120? Okay, thank you. That you've corrected me. But 120,000 Jews in Germany, many of them emigres from the former Soviet Union. So that when you have my sadness about Germany is that the ghosts that the exhibitor made reference to are basically the Jewish culture that's there of a past that once was. But there isn't a lot of interaction between Jews and Germans on the ground as there is an interaction between Jews and Americans in the United States or Jews and Canadians or some other countries in which there are significant numbers of Jews who have impact. I've often said that although I appreciate interfaith relations in this country, and I've always tried to have very good relationships with members of the other faiths here in the city, selfishly, I mean, beyond my wish to establish cordial relationships, selfishly, I have to recognize that if we need their help, if we first start courting them or visiting them, when there's a crisis, they're not going to be interested in talking to us. And so it's very important to have a Jewish population on the ground, in spite of the fact that, yes, it would be nice if everyone could pack up and fulfill the Zionist dream.
But Rabbi Pierce, you have to admit, Jewish life in Germany is slightly anomalous. It's not the same as Jewish life in Rome or in London or in San Francisco.
There's no question about that, and part of it is the history. But I have a little sign in my office that I very often point to when people come in to deal with issues and problems, and they spew this litany of all of the things that have been done to them and whatever. And the sign says, "Never let yesterday use up tomorrow." I'll say to them, can you change the fact that you had a knockdown, drag-out battle 10 years ago that you've never let go? No, can't. So then I would say to them, then what's the point? We can't let yesterday use up tomorrow. We really have to go forward, and we have to use the resources that we have. So if there are 120,000 Jews in Germany, we shouldn't be neglecting them. We should be getting down on the home front so that they can become advocates and ambassadors for the state of Israel. One of the problems that we're facing in this country is that there are many Jews who are now leaning politically toward the left and are no longer supporting Israel in the way that Jews did when I was growing up. I mean, who would ever thought of criticizing Israel? I can remember as a young rabbi in the early 1970s, I had delivered a sermon about an incident in which an Arab school that was on the site of the area surrounding the Temple Mount that had to be excavated, that the Israeli soldiers had they ordered everyone out of the school, and there was a piece that an Israeli soldier wrote in a journal called Shteimot, which is, I think, no longer published, in which he said that as he was about to throw a tear gas canister into the Arab school, his eyes met the eyes of an Arab child. He said, and he threw it anyway, and then he understood how the Nazis could do what they did. Well, I delivered that sermon. I had resignations from the congregation, because although I was trying to present a balanced point of view, people were outraged that I would say anything that would criticize Israel in any way. That has disappeared. It's become, in some circles, de rigueur to criticize Israel. And from my point of view, that's not acceptable, but it's going on.
I would love to bring some of our audience members into the conversation. And I think I'm going to be the walker with the microphone. So,
for many years of my life, there were two Germanys rather than one. Is there any difference in the history of East or West Germany in terms of creating the atmosphere for the attitudes of the average person towards Israel?
I think we should hear from the expert.
Well, you have to go a little bit to the history to explain. East Germany had a very interesting theory, official theory as a state. I oversimplify, but the theory went, we are a communist country, we have a communist government, and the communists were, in some cases even before the Jews, the victims of the Nazis, because they were the first ones that were imprisoned in maybe not concentration camps at the beginning, but in prisons. So our history is the history of the good, because we are actually in the same boat as were the Jews. The Jews were inmates in concentration camps and communists were. So we, communists, East Germany, just connect to this part of the German history. And that's what we identify with. That's why we have no responsibility for that other part of the German history, which were the Nazis. They were the enemies of the communists. They were the enemies of the Jews. So the East German government, for that reason, but for one other reason too, did not make until the very end, when it almost was ready to collapse, any effort to reach out to Israel or restitution payments or reparations or indemnification and so on. Because they just said, well, that's not part of our history. We are the good ones. So they did not accept German history and the responsibility for the Holocaust as West Germany did. Basic difference. So people were brought up with that. But I don't think that today there is a basic difference in attitude in East Germany and West Germany about Israel. But Akiva said something that he's concerned about, because he says there's some kind of disconnect between the attitudes of the German government, which you may call very pro-Israeli, and the attitudes of larger sections of the German society, which is, at least that's the way he thinks it is, less pro-Israeli. I get this question very often in the talks, and I would say the basic difference between, and you alluded to that's different in America. Whether that is so, I don't know, but let's say it is a little bit different in Germany or Europe on the one hand, and in the United States on the other hand. I think I can explain that only this way. When Europeans, including Germans, look at the Middle East, I believe they look basically at the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. When Americans look at Israel or the Middle East, they look at the wider context of Israel in the sea of Arab and Muslim countries. So when you take these two perspectives, you may come to different conclusions. Because if you look at the wider picture, a small country of 6 million Israelis in the sea of hundreds of millions of more or less hostile Arabs and Muslims, Israel is really small and weak. Just in general, it isn't, but let's look at this perspective. When you look at the sub-conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, this perspective may be different. Because until up to the Six-Day War, I think in all of Europe, including, of course, Germany, Israel was perceived as being the weaker side. After the Six-Day War and later on, it was perceived as a much stronger side. So I think it is a kind of natural reaction of many people. I just try to explain it. I don't legitimize it. I just say, I think many people would rather sympathize with the weaker side. So from the global perspective, maybe Israel is the weaker side. If you look at just the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians and not what is around it, this may be different. And this, in my view, explains a little bit the different attitudes that prevail in the United States and in Israel, in the societies regarding Israel.
I think our problems in Europe are that the issue of the European perception is something we should maybe defer for another evening, because it will poison our discussion. But let me give you an example of what I mean. Not regarding Europe, regarding Germany. On the one hand, Germany has provided to Israel a Dolphin submarine, which is a strategic platform, and let's leave it at that. And Germany is the only country which did it, including the United States. And that means something very deep. And that's a formal decision of the German government. It's a historic. It's a decision which shows a certain kind of understanding of history. But if we'll look at the German economy is more deeply engaged with Iran than any country in Europe. And that's what I mean by the disconnect.
The blouse.
I'd like to just mention a little of this museum's history, that when it first opened in 1985 at the Jewish Community Federation building, the first exhibit was, I would say, courageously sponsored by Lufthansa, and it was called 1,000 Years of Anti-Semitism in Germany. The message that I got from it was that the churches in Germany had taught anti-Semitism for 1,000 years, and that it preconditioned the people right up to the time of the Holocaust. Rolf, is there, what is the mood or the way that the churches are presently teaching in Germany?
Well, it is true what you said. I mean, even Luther was in many respects and had anti-Semitic views. And we know about the Catholic Church and the Nazis and so on. So it's no secret to anybody that Christian religion has anti-Semitic aspects all through the Christian history, and that was nothing particular about the German churches. Of course, especially, well, both churches, but especially some large parts of the Protestant churches even collaborated with the Nazis and so on. And we can't go into details. However, when we talk about the early relations that were established between Germany and Israel, for example, the churches were among the first groups that tried to, establish these relations and send young people from the churches to kibbutzim and other places in Israel. And there is, for example, one organization in Germany that is called Aktion Sühnezeichen, which translates Action Reconciliation. And it's young people that do a kind of volunteer year, either in retirement homes in Israel, also in the United States, Jewish retirement homes. They work in concentration camps, they work at Yad Vashem and so on. And many of these volunteers are actually Christians, very active Christians, not just on the books. So I would say what is true for German society and especially politics in general is also true for the churches, that they face their wrongdoings in the past by standing in a tradition of Christian antisemitism, as well as collaborating, at least to a large degree, with the Nazis.
Being German and growing up in Germany and then coming to the US and seeing, or in between living in Switzerland for a long time and then coming to the US and living in the US, I think the awareness that one gets here for what Jewish culture is and what German Jewish is a much, much different thing than what you learn when you are actually in Germany and when you're surrounded by exactly that. One thing that in particular puzzled me over time was learning that the town that I grew in, which is Hamburg, had a very dominant German Jewish community, particularly on the merchant side and particularly on the intelligentsia side. Looking back, I'm wondering a little bit if Germany is really correctly looking at how much Jewish contribution to the entire economy really was made and how that is being appreciated. And I just want to throw out the family of Warburg, for instance, which is, like many other German Jewish families, had their sons go to London and go to New York and grow the business there. Kleinwort being another one. All these finance empires have been founded by German Jewish families. And I think that, and this is something that you're not being taught when you grow up in Germany. And I think there's a complete underappreciation from a German perspective as to the economic power that was contributed to Germany, and that made Germany what Germany was. And I think there should be some more appreciation for that one, this pride for what German Jewish people contributed.
Unfortunately, the events of World War II so leapfrog 1,000 years of German Jewish history that it gets neglected in much the same way that even in this country, from the time that I was growing up, Israel and the Holocaust were the two main focuses for teaching children in religious schools until one day the Jewish community woke up and discovered it doesn't have any currency anymore. So I think that will eventually solve itself as we get further and further away from the Shoah. There isn't going to be the same kind of obsessive, I'm not saying that in a pejorative way, but in a psychological way, obsessive focus on the most recent events, and that we can now begin. For example, in Poland, a museum of Jewish history is opening in Warsaw, as opposed to all of the monuments to the destruction that took place among the Jews in that community.
May I just add one more thing? I agree with what you say. We learn very little about it, exactly also for the same reason that German Jewish history is kind of focused on the Nazi years. But there is a great interest in this part of the 2,000 years of German Jewish history, which goes back to the Roman times, actually. when you look at the Jewish museums in Germany that have been constructed recently, for example, the Jewish Museum in Berlin, which shares with this museum here its architect. This museum in Berlin, the Jewish Museum in Berlin, is actually on German Jewish history through the ages, and not only on the Holocaust, even though the Holocaust here do play a major role also in the museum, understandably. However, this museum is in Berlin, which is a city of many museums, the most visited museum of the city of Berlin. And in the first year alone, there were 3.5 million visitors. So that shows, I think, that on the part of the German population, there is great interest to learn more about the other aspects of this 2,000-year German Jewish history.
I would just add something to that also, and I'm hoping that what you're longing for will actually take place. But there is an unusual interest in Judaism, in Jewish life in Israel, in many areas in Germany. One of the most bizarre experiences of my entire life was being in Krakow for the Jewish festival that takes place every late June or early July. It's like a 10-day festival in which Polish citizens, not Jews, come and take courses and visit exhibits, and it culminates in several days of a soundstage being set up in the old Jewish square in Krakow, in which tens of thousands of Poles turn out. Theodor Bekel performs, all kinds of Israeli performers. The crowd is swaying back and forth, saying "Hine matovu manayim," and 99% of them are Catholics. I mean, it's like it is so strange, but there is a thirst for learning among the Christian population, and it will be nice when it finally finds currency among the Jews as well.
We have time for one more question.
This is Rolf Schuette. Since so much of recent German Jewish history is Russian German Jewish history, I'm interested in the extent to which especially younger Jews in Germany of Russian origin have integrated into German culture as earlier generations of German Jews did.
Yeah, the growth of German Jewish presence in the past 20 years, I would say, is mainly due to immigration from the former Soviet Union, from, let's say, Russian Jewry. And I think it's too early, the question, to answer your question, because the immigration is just 10 to 15 years old. So these people came, first of all, we talked about that. I mean, many of them did not have a very strong Jewish identity to begin with when they came. And I think in Israel it's somewhat similar. Some of the Jewish immigration from the former Soviet Union. So they came to Germany, whatever the Zionist dream was, because maybe for them at this moment it was more convenient, or whatever personal reasons were behind it. But I think it is still too early, because I must say that my personal observation is that in Berlin, for example, there is a large Russian population, and some are Jews, some are Russians, some are so-called German Russians or Russian Germans, people from the Caucasus. They share all one thing, that's their mother tongue. They all speak Russian. They have different religious backgrounds or no religious background whatsoever. And when you look at the fact that on the immigration quota for Russian Jews, 190,000 people came on the program. But today, altogether, including the already existing Jewish community in Germany that was there before the immigration started, and other influx from other countries, it's amazing that we have to say that today probably there are 120,000 Jews. Where are the rest? Even if 200,000 came. I mean, they didn't make Aliyah, I think, but they are still in Germany, but they don't identify as Jews. They just maybe identify more as Russians. And the so-called Germans that came from the former Soviet Union, when I listen to them, they sound pretty Russian to me and not very German. So in a way, it's a similar appearance. I mean, it's the religious identity or the national identity may be not so much on many individuals' minds.
Maybe have opportunity.
I know you're getting ready to tie the loose ends together, but Consul General Schuette is leaving tomorrow morning to return to Berlin to be the chief of protocol, and it's really just been such a privilege to have him here in the city that I hope that you'll all thank you.
I was just going to ask you to tie up any loose ends. Any final thoughts anybody has? Now would be a good time.
I want to say goodbye to Rolf. We did this in synagogue, and I don't know. Well, Rabbi Pierce, I'm assuming that everyone here was in shul on Friday night, but
In different shuls, not all just at Temple Emanu-El.
oh, but so I'm going to risk repeating simply a few of the things I said there. And I've only known Rolf for a year, but I heard about him from my predecessor, Davidi. They were all over the Pacific Northwest talking about Israel-German relations in the 60th year. I think you're going to the perfect job, and it's incredible because bureaucracies generally don't send people to the right places, but apparently it's happened in this case because I can't imagine of a better kind of diplomat, Talmid Chacham, a wise student diplomat, to serve the city of Berlin, which a city of so many contradictions, so much greatness, so much Judaism, so much Nazism. You're the right person for this job, and we'll look forward to working with you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Toda rabba.
Thank you.